This week on the Sports Initiative podcast, I sit down with Head of Rugby Operations at Munster Rugby, Ian Costello. He discusses the implementation of the Munster Way and the process it took to create this, talent ID within the sport, and how they have tried to develop these practices, as well as using external feedback as signposts for what needs to be done in the future. As always, if you enjoy this podcast, please make sure you share it with friends and family. I hope you enjoy. Right, Ian, I appreciate you being particularly patient with me on this one. I know we've caught up a couple of times for a few different bits, which we'll come on to during this. And then we did have a date in the diary, which I completely missed just through work and stuff. So, yeah, I really appreciate you being patient. How are things with you?
Things are great, and look, no problem at all. We've obviously had a couple of really good chats recently, and I've certainly got a lot more off you than you've gotten off me. So you owed me one, so no problem at all. And looking forward to the chat.
Yeah, no, it should be really good. And as I said, we've caught up a couple of times, introduced via Jamie, who was one of our former guests, and kindly put us in touch. And it's been a really useful link so far. Hopefully, one that continues. For people that maybe haven't come across you, don't know who you are, do you just want to give a bit of an oversight of who you are, what you do from a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, no problem. I suppose the easiest to work backwards. I started a new role at Munster Rugby as Head of Rugby Operations. That's a new role at the club. So finding my feet a bit 3 months in. I suppose the focus on that, ironically, it says rugby operations, but it's very much a strategic role, looking at the short, medium, and long term, maybe decision making at the club, with a real focus around player development, our systems, how we implement different things around our talent systems, right through into the senior team, into recruitment, retention, contracting. And involved in a lot of cool pieces like culture and leadership as well. So as I said, early doors on that and finding my feet a bit with that one. The previous 2 years I was head of the academy and pathway at Munster. I came home from the UK after being there for 5 years, and I suppose maybe 11 years in total coaching professionally, 3 years at Wasps. Defence was probably my primary focus. I was head coach in Nottingham in the championship for the 2 years before that. And then prior to that was another stint with Munster. I did 6 years with the senior team and a couple of years with the academy as well, with a few bits and pieces in around that. So I suppose predominantly a coaching background, and then transitioning more into talent development, and now a little bit more strategy, I suppose.
Nice. I think, really broad range of experiences, which are really useful. I guess the easiest starting point is if I were to come and watch Munster pathway teams or, progression teams going to their first team over a weekend, what would those within the club hope that I would see from a Munster team and Munster players?
Well, hopefully after what we've, maybe done over the last couple of years, I'd like to think that there's a very aligned and coherent Munster way now. I think if you looked at any team wearing a red jersey with a Munster crest, you would know what they represent and what they stand for. We've worked hard around having a really clear game model, clear technical direction in what we coach and how we coach it. I would make no apologies about the quality of coaching of being the number one priority around our player development. We think that has the most impact. I'd like to think, as I said, that our practices, our values and beliefs are aligned and pretty coherent, but within a certain bandwidth. We'd certainly encourage variability. I think that's a huge part of players and staff developing, and people being able to bring their own style and their own methodology to how they coach, how they lead, etc. So I think that's hopefully something you would see, and then maybe from a senior team perspective, I've really established in the last 12 months with a new coaching group, again, what we stand for. A high intensity, ball and play, high skill challenge type of game that fortunately we had one of those seasons last year where we had a huge amount of momentum at the end of the year, and it carried us through to the first trophy in 12 years. So yeah, exciting times at the club, and hopefully you'd sense that excitement and passion and hunger to get better, not standing still, and build on what we've done the last couple of years.
And so when you're trying to pull that methodology, game models or ideas, values together, what does that overarching process look like for you as a club? How did you decipher through the reams of information which is online, or experiences in the room to go, right, this is the values and stuff that we want to possess and have?
Yeah, I think the first thing is how we went about it is probably the most important thing, as I think you touched on there, Michael. It was a series year one of 12 alignment meetings with all the staff on the pathway. So we took our time because the key outcome we wanted to bring this to life, and we wanted to be sustainable. We felt the way to do that, we made an early decision that there had to be ownership, people had to be invested, and they had to feel part of the process. So we did it in an incremental way, to the point that at the end of 2 years, we now have, pretty much everything we want to have centralized, in that it's documented, and very, very clear what that Munster way is now. So it was a tough process in that there was, as I said, 12 meetings in a year and then 8 in the second year. So a series of 20 alignment meetings, and that's just the workshop piece. And then there's countless hours working together, coaching together. And we very much adopt the model of, social learning, where we like the learning and sharing ideas to be really organic. We spend a lot of time together. We deliberately put aside a lot of time to I suppose evolve what we're doing. And where possible, that to occur as naturally as possible, and probably guided by a few key people as well. So I suppose that's the process, and what underpinned that was some very clear objectives. And we worked very hard to get vertical alignment within the building, from our senior team to our academy and to our pathway. That's probably our super strength now, and we can go into that a little bit more. But then, because Munster is a region, and those who don't know it, it's very community based. It spreads across 6 counties, so schools and clubs are massive in that. We have a lot of key stakeholders, so we work very hard on the horizontal coherence as well. So when we came in, I suppose we had maybe 3 very, very key objectives to bring that to life, and yeah, so far so good, but it needs ongoing attention.
Yeah, I was going to touch on the objectives piece. So you mentioned around having some key objectives there. Could you give us an example of maybe one of them, and how you were able to really, I guess, attune those meetings or those collaboration pieces or the ideas to that particular objective?
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I'll answer that in 2 ways. One is, I suppose, visually, if we could see it, we'd see 3 intersecting circles where they all connect between the pro game, the academy, and the pathway, or what would be called rugby development. We kind of got rid of the term elite and development, and we changed that to one pathway. That was a massive change, even though it might be semantic. It gave us a good shared understanding of what we're looking for, a good model to work from. So the key objectives, I suppose, were to establish a very clear model and a very clear framework in terms of that shared understanding, and for it to become part of the consciousness of the whole organization. The actions that underpin that were the key relationships between academy and pro staff, even how we're situated in the building, our presence in meetings, and a huge amount of organic interaction both ways. And then the same between the academy and rugby development. We deliberately created a lot of touch points where we worked together and formally met as well. So some quite focused strategies around that I suppose, yeah, there's a formal sense to them, but the real strength was in the informal, organic nature of that. And by spending a lot of time together, it became a little bit more natural in terms of those objectives. So yeah, that's an example of a couple of them, and then we can talk maybe about I suppose the detail that underpins that, our technical direction. We have a cornerstones program, very clear on what our attack, defense, transition principles are, and again, how our game model impacts all of that. So that became a key objective to align that from top to bottom.
Okay, that's a really nice segue. Let's explore that. So, in terms of understanding those principles or the game model, etc. How did you, as an entire club, come to the decision that that's the game model you want to have? Because I know previously, and being in football in the UK, managers change relatively quickly. I think it's fair to say. And if you go down maybe what the first team manager now wants, within 6 months it could be a new one, and you're chopping and changing, and it becomes very messy. So I'd imagine you'd want a level of alignment and a level of consistency of what's being taught to players, so that you're preparing them to hopefully make that top level. So what did that process look like in terms of research and deciding actually the way we're going to go is this?
Yeah, and look, that's been the main body of work. And again, let's put context is king, isn't it, in everything. And you've just touched on, a technical model needs to live beyond, transition of staff, turnover of staff, and especially at the top level, it's so difficult to design and implement a technical program that if it changes every 12 to 24 months, I think we'll struggle to get any identity and consistency. So the context is we had a change in coaching group a year ago. So when I came into the job, it was under a different coaching group. And you probably couldn't get more contrasting styles of play. And again, those who are familiar with Munster, if they look 2 years ago versus 1 year ago, they literally were poles apart. So that provides our I suppose presents a certain challenge, but we use a couple of guidelines around that. Is my job, I suppose, is to interpret and filter what the senior team are doing, interpret and filter it down to the pathway and see what's relevant for the academy, for the NTS, which is our national talent squad, right down to our age grade squads. And they're all time dependent in that our academy train full time with our seniors. So alignment needs to be close to 100%. NTS are probably the guys who we hope to be professional in the next 3 years, and then work our way down to our 19s, 18s, etc. So rather than necessarily a passport of what you do at each level, we designed again a bandwidth where we worked off a principle-based model. And that principle-based model, again, visually, we brought that to life with 4 key principles around the outside. A foundation that was very much specific to the Munster identity, and then a clear piece in the middle where everybody was clear what type of players we were trying to produce. So now we had a framework that guided all our session design, our session planning, how we coached, how we questioned, and players were very, very clear around what that identity looked like and what the expectations were from them around getting selected in a red jersey.
So what would that look like? What would the type of players that Munster are looking to progress into their first team environment, what does that currently look like?
Yeah, that's pretty timely because we've done a couple of pieces of work and we've evolved that. And I suppose if I was to, you're testing my memory now here without notes in front of me, but the game model would be around starting fast, playing fast, high tempo. Something that would be, if you can picture a wheel, that'd be one of the points. And I just want to be clear, this is very much the pathway model. Relentless both sides of the ball, looking to develop decision makers under pressure. And the last point was nobody is bigger than a Munster team. BIG is back in game. And again, we measure ourselves in terms of work ethic. And if we're as an environment, I know everybody has all their key values. We would have been around work rate and discipline in particular as two of the big ones. And belief really underpinned what we did last year. The players we're looking for, again, to play for Munster, you need to be tough. That's physically and mentally. You need to be competitive, disciplined in terms of application and focus around being the type of professionals that we're going to look for in our environment. Work ethic, as I said, underpins it all. And then underneath that, we were looking for players that were smart decision makers and comfortable on the ball. So things that traditionally probably weren't associated with 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds within our pathway. So everything we did, all our practices needed to align towards that. And again, as I said, having that shared consciousness of exactly what that looked like. And we just reviewed our summer program. And what was really pleasing was our 3 key teams that we have all use that model as the basis for how they planned, reviewed and previewed. And that's what I mean by the model coming to life. And my sense is because they were all involved and invested in putting that together stage by stage, I think there's a lot more ownership and responsibility around keeping that alive.
Yeah, there's a couple of segues that I want to take there, but I'll choose this one first. So you've mentioned the, I guess, historical thing that you might not have seen those types of players progressing or being identified. How did you guys go around either changing perception for your existing staff and making them realise that actually this is a positive moving forward and this is why it's a necessity, even though historically we haven't done this? Or secondly, how did you identify individuals that you thought were external that would be suitable to really, bring this game model to life and allow you to show what best practice in this type of space looks like?
I suppose, like anything, again, it's talking to people, coming in day one and spending the first, couple of months listening to what people had to say, listening to what the Irish Rugby Union had to say around maybe why we didn't have as many players in national squads, where they felt the gaps were, observing matches, observing sessions, looking at data, and comparing that with, worldwide best practice and best principles. Very lucky, as how we met Michael, involved in doing a bit of research with Jamie Taylor. So I had a lot of access to what really good looks like, both applied and from a research and literature point of view. So very much take a pragmatic view in that, around what works and what is practical. But the more evidence informed it is, the more research informed it is, again, we think that that's going to be far more robust. So I think in terms of what we did, there was a lot of foundation work, first of all. So again, around building buy-in was getting people involved in the process. So we identified a number of areas, like a catch pass from a rugby point of view, which would be, you kind of consider at your general skill level. We didn't pass the ball enough in training matches. We didn't practice enough in training. So as a result, the game was quite slow. There wasn't enough of an emphasis on our breakdown, and our breakdown is what we now call the heartbeat of our attack. It's what pumps oxygen to the rest of the body. There wasn't enough emphasis on that. And then probably the overriding one is it was very much a deconstructed training model, very much a part model. And we want to develop game understanding and contextual training, representative training. So again, I suppose my job was to steer that from a technical alignment point of view, to say, here is a pie chart, and at this time of year, here is what we want to see when we step onto the pitch. And it might be 50% unstructured, 33% working on our cornerstones, which is the program we gave to our fundamentals, and then maybe a much smaller percentage looking at what your game plan might be. So we just shifted the emphasis and focus. And probably, if I'm honest, then we police that, and we've a really good team that quality control that, to make sure that we're staying true to what we said we would do. So look, hopefully that answers the majority of the question. The external piece was probably just people like yourself talking to get other views, other perspectives. And when we had an opportunity to hire somebody that we thought was the best candidate from another environment, if they were the right fit for us, we didn't hesitate in bringing people in from the outside.
I really like the feedback that you said around the national team as well, because you mentioned around why haven't we got as many players in there. It'd be really easy to go, oh, well, it's because so-and-so is in there and he doesn't like Munster players, or because they play a certain way, which our players don't do. And so that's their problem, not ours. Whereas actually having that as a resource to say, actually, like, where's their skills deficiency? You're an objective eye to a certain point of view. Where are our players lacking that we need to help them improve to allow them opportunities to ultimately play at the highest level of their age group rugby? So it's almost like a really useful feedback tool via an external source that allows you to not have an entire picture, but gain part of the picture, right?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things that spring to mind there, Michael. Look, straight up, the perception of the Munster pathway was there was a certain type of player at a certain type of level, and it was reflected in national selection. And we know, anecdotally and factually, if we get people from red shirts into green shirts, the experiences that brings, it accelerates their development. And we know now that if you play for the Irish under-20 team, 28 out of the 35 that are in the senior squad have come through that Irish 20s pathway. that particular group. So we know it's important as a marker, not essential, but we know that the probability is if they come through that, they have a chance of progressing to the top level. So we worked very hard to change the perception of the Munster pathway, the perception of how people prepared to train and play the game. And we made it a big focus around players and staff and celebrating how they developed and people moving on. And we've had, again, very steady growth in terms of the representation we've had at Irish 18s, 19s and 20s level. And we've a certain target in mind where we'd like to get to. And we're just a little bit short of that at the moment. But what it really meant is we had to change how we prepared players to play. And I'll give you one example just to bring that to life. The players struggled with the intensity at national camp, right? The gap between what they did in their clubs and schools versus national level needed to be bridged. And one of the first things we did is we ran a series of 6 weeks of sessions where we brought in collective sessions when we brought in our best underage players. And the big focus was like point one of our game model: play fast, start fast, play fast, high tempo. And we made that the overarching theme of all our sessions. Yes, we tested skills, but we didn't stop. We said that has to be priority and intention number one. And then I suppose, again, anecdotally, we debriefed all of those players when they went up to national camp. How well prepared did you feel compared this time versus last time? We got some very good evidence, very good data back that said, yeah, they felt far more prepared. They were able to deal with the challenges up there, and it was reflected in selection. So I suppose that's real life decision making or programs that have an immediate bearing. And we've learned from stuff like that, and that kind of intelligence has helped us evolve and make our programs even better.
And I think, yeah, as you said, you've got a duty of care almost with that progression rate of having 28 out of 35 going on. It's important that you're in a position to give them the opportunity. And actually, if it's just a way we're coaching as part of our game model that allows you to do that, well, that's a really simple starting point, which us as a club can adapt and try and assess. Moving, I guess, this is going to take 2 segues. The first one around the talent ID. So how did you as a club identify players that were suitable to do this model? Because I imagine it would be different. You watch the Rugby World Cup at the moment, and you're going to see different types of players that are suitable for one system and not so suitable for the other. So how did you guys go around doing that? And then secondly, I know we initially met around your research piece into talent identification. So do you want to explain to everyone, I guess, what that has entailed and what's come up off the back of that?
Yeah, no problem. I'll go to the second bit first, Michael. I suppose what I'm looking at the moment is, and nearly finished, was hoping to have it finished in the next week or so, but I think it might take a couple more weeks, was around basically the individual and systemic factors that influence talent selection. So really looking at context, and like talent ID is unbelievably complex, and people that tell you they know for sure somebody will do X or Y, it just doesn't stack up, and it's highly nuanced. And probably the more you read, the more you go, the more you realize how much more that you need to learn. But we still have to make decisions, and so we can't delay making decisions while research and literature and everything else catches up. So I suppose what came out of my research, first of all, is that there's 3 levels: micro, meso, and macro, which basically means micro is a fancy word for individual judgments. Meso is the organization and the influence that the organization has. And then macro could be like the national governing body, resources, etc. And the reality is talent selection, decision making is affected right across that spectrum. So an individual, like you're picking somebody, Michael, it depends on your education and experience. It depends on bias, it depends on noise, it depends on a lot of individual factors. The organization depends on senior coaches, the values and culture in organization. It depends on succession planning and depth charts. Is there opportunity? And to a certain degree, resources as well, because you've got to make decisions with generally, and this is the thing that fascinates me most, is you've limited resources, especially in rugby, and you've got to make decisions or cut your cloth to measure. And the best way to make decisions you'd imagine would be when you've got the best information. And that's not always the case. So you often deploy resources without having the intelligence to back it up. And then in our context, from a rugby context, I suppose the macro is the Irish Rugby Union. I suppose there's a dual management system around how you identify players and how you select players. And then there's other policy things as well. So it's pretty fascinating. But I suppose essentially to turn that into practice and to go back to your first question is we spent again 6 months and I used our interview, Michael, and there was 11 others. I used some of the information out of that to produce a document, a one pager around what we're looking for. So what does a Munster rugby player look like and look for? And basically we took that research and then Munsterized it, for the want of a better term. So we have a very clear idea now from a technical, tactical, physical and psychological point of view, what pillars we think there are to our talent ID process. And then we have an overarching, higher order traits or key qualities for maybe a more applied term around what we're looking for. And that now guides our talent selection. We didn't have that. It guides our talent ID. So every time we have this document to refer back to, well, are they ticking 75% of these boxes? Have they got the 3 of the 5 overarching traits that we think are vital? And I think whatever way you go about it, having a framework and having something that a model that everybody can relate to. So we don't want an echo chamber. We don't want everyone thinking the same, but we still need something guiding our decision making. And we've literally just got that piece of work finished in the last month.
And what's the reception been from staff? Because obviously, I appreciate some of it's going to be coaching or MDT going to be supporting and stuff, but they all have a role in terms of assessing players or narratives around players. If someone says that if an S&C coach says that someone's looking sluggish and slow, they say it to the coach. All of a sudden, the narrative around that player becomes that. So what's the reception be around these pillars, and how have you found them understanding the need for having a framework of where we can, I guess, stringently assess them on certain factors we know are important throughout the pathway?
Yeah, I'm going to come back again and look. Sometimes I apologize for repeating myself, but actually I need to stop doing that because it's about being consistent. And what I mean by that is we involved everybody in the process and we took our time doing it. So the 12 interviews I did as part of my research formed one part of it. Everybody in the pathway was involved in workshops putting it together. And then we moved on to senior staff and we went department by department in terms of pulling out what they believe were the key qualities. And we finished off with the senior coaching group when 90% of the work was done. And that was very much with the aim of Munsterizing it. So what I mean by the consistency is if we want this to live on and we want these to be something that we bring to life and stays alive, having everybody involved in that and then constantly referring to it, constantly putting it out in meetings when you're talking around selection, when you're talking about decision making, about people transitioning from one level to the next. And I think that's where it's a guide, it's a framework. It's not a non-negotiable because I think that's what's amazing about talent development is it emerges, it's dynamic, it's so much influenced by your experiences and your development. And probably to pick an example, the one that, sometimes you hear something and it just stays with you. And there's a presentation from David Court, who's involved with England cricket and the FA, and he talked about the key pillars. And Shane Warne, for example, didn't meet maybe 3 of the 4 criteria, but he had one that was world class, and he turned out to be a world class cricketer. Now, this is from someone who knows nothing about cricket, right? But that always stands to me that you have to have room in your pathway for the unicorn and the outlier, but you can't design your pathway for the unicorn. You got to design around probability and what works. So that framework for us guides the majority of our decisions, but we never exclude somebody completely on the basis of it. Hopefully that makes sense in that example. And I'm sure somebody can think of one in every sport, and that's the one that stuck with me.
It's a really nice analogy in terms of what you're saying there. And I think having had our conversation before, those pillars idea, it's all obviously an assessment tool, but it's also ability to see where, super strengths may lay. And all of a sudden, if you're assessing someone and you're going, they are an exceptional, they're an exceptional under the high ball, for example, that is from a technical and tactical standpoint, that is what they are brilliant at. You know, as a coaching staff, that you can keep working with them on that to make it world class, and that might help them forge a career in the game, whilst obviously working on all those other technical bits around it. So I think that, you know, having that as a factor to say, we know that there's a super strength here, or we know that their character is, you know, really puts them in a area of their own compared to previous year groups or previous individuals that we've had in that position. It's just a way to, I guess, retain historical data and current, continuously assess them about what previous people have done and what future proofing may look like.
Yeah, and you touched a couple of things there, and one of the if there was a headline for that work that we did, it was that the psychosocial characteristics were considered the key qualities, like overwhelming majority. So when people reflected on, you know, I know there's a survivor bias element to it, but reflected on why certain people made it and certain people didn't, it came back to things like work ethic, discipline, motivation, competitiveness, desire to practice. It came down, they were our higher order qualities. So once the players reached a certain level, it became character based, or it became, you know, I suppose mental, in terms of mental skills, became they were weighted to a higher degree. And that was a big part of the research, that information is weighted differently at different times throughout the pathway. And as you become more experienced and educated as a selector, I suppose, again, you weight different things differently, but character constantly came out on top, which is great, you know, because I think it's good to get that consistency when you talk to people that work in the business and research as well.
And did that change your game model or training model, curriculum? Did it change the way that you guys look to coach and the type of environments you were looking to create for the players?
Subtle changes, I would say, around things like competitiveness came out as a key quality. So again, when we look at the pie chart that guides, you know, the time we spend in each area of the game, one of the things that we looked at was there needs to be a thread of competition through a number of sessions in a week. So yes, the focus is, we have a long-term agenda from a development point of view, but I suppose I'm working between both development and performance. But competitiveness treads through both. It doesn't need to be about winning games at development, but it needs to be about learning to compete, learning about consequences, learning how to prepare to win as well. If that makes sense, without even having to focus on winning week in, week out. At the top level, at elite level, I suppose we need to win week in, week out. But again, a thread of competitiveness through how we coach would have been one of the outcomes from that. So that would have been one. Work ethic, another one, but that's probably that's the one that I think evolved the most following this piece of work. And probably one other little piece, Michael, that you touched on, and you really helped me with this when we spoke recently. Are you certainly, I suppose, kind of flick the switch around performance and potential. It's how we educate ourselves that you've got performance now, but we know that is not a strong indicator of future performance. So how do we, again, articulate what potential might look like? So, and that's what's so exciting about talent. And all we do now is we ask ourselves those questions. So we have a document, and you know, you inspired a little bit of that in terms of work that you shared with me. And we've evolved that to a Munster version of that. So we're asking the right questions around current performance, and then same thing, what are the indicators that this person has potential to go to the next level? And because of the work we've done, we put a lot of stock, or we weight a lot of value on character traits now.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting piece. I had Wayne Goldsmith on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he was talking about a lot of qualifications and around how they'd gone very technical and tactical based. And he said that actually, if he was to rewrite an entire curriculum, he would focus those mainly on character traits. He said, because it seems like every sport that you go to, people say the thing that helps people stand out is character traits or psychological capabilities rather than technical or tactical skills. So he said maybe it would be useful if we earlier on in pathways, that was a focus of what we were trying to do. We'll focus on resilience, or we're going to focus on competitiveness and allow them to address that. And your competitiveness piece is a really interesting one. I speak to the kids about it quite a lot. From a 1v1 perspective, there's certain practices I put in place to allow them to, move up a league or down a league if you win or lose, or, focusing on trying to find other people that win, other people that lose, partly for matchups, but partly for that psychological challenge that they have. And the biggest come away I give to them is, if you're not competing with your partner, you're not only are you doing yourself a disservice, because actually you're not playing or training to the highest capability of yourself, but you're also doing them a disservice, because if I'm an attacker and you're not defending against me as you would in a game, that's not preparing me for what the weekend looks like. So actually, let's help each other get better. You're all friends here, and particularly, I'm working Foundation for Kids. I was like, you're all friends here. You love being around one another. Let's help them be the best version of whoever they are going to be. And you can see the kids kind of nodding along, liking the idea that they get to help their best friend be a little bit better by being competitive. So I think you can do it in the right way and frame it in the right way, regardless of age, just so that it does allow them to understand that competitiveness is going to be there throughout. We're just staggering what it looks like depending on your age group.
Yeah, look, that's brilliant. I've written down a few of those things, Michael. And it's framing it, and it's not always about the result in a game, whereas that's where I think everyone's mind goes to straight away. A couple of things maybe that are worth sharing is I think that's one of the key reasons why our senior team at the moment is performing really well. I think we've got genuine competitiveness within the squad. And that's on the back of some of the work that we've talked about. There is excitement around the quality of player that's coming through. And then to give huge credit to our head coach, Graham Roundtree, and the senior coaches, these players get exposed regularly to senior training. So we learned kind of by accident when we had a situation 2 years ago when 35 players and staff got stuck with COVID. They go into quarantine, and we had to play a European Cup game against Wasps. Basically, we had 9 senior players and 14 players that had never represented Munster, that had come from below our academy. And we came together to, for 2 weeks, and we ended up winning a game. But that experience taught us about alignment and coherence, taught us about role modeling and players being exposed to a higher level. So we took that learnings and now we plan it. So right now, during the World Cup, we've 8 under-20s that are in training with the senior team full time. And we have what's called our national talent squad, which is below our academy, training, a number of those training full time with our senior team. And that's really accelerating their rate of development. But what it's doing as well is it means people are looking over their shoulder and they're seeing these guys that are coming for, potentially for their jerseys and contracts in the future. And it has created a real sense of competitiveness, genuine competitiveness. And the only way that gets cemented is through selection. And that's where Graham in particular deserves a huge amount of credit. He picks people on form. He picks people regardless of age and experience. And as a result of that, they've accelerated really quickly and they've repaid his faith in them. So I suppose what am I saying is competitiveness, again, is age and stage appropriate. It can be one-on-one, as you spoke about. It can be moving up and down leaderboards, or it can be breaking into a team to go and win a trophy as well. And as you said, everybody has a responsibility to help a team prepare for that. And we put a huge amount of emphasis on the non-23 or the 15 guys in bibs that go against the first team. And your responsibility is to prepare them to train at the weekend. And yeah, that's in a good place at the club at the moment.
Yeah, I actually saw this on social media. One of the more useful things that I've come across recently, there was a clip around Bill Belichick of the New England Patriots discussing the interception that one of his players made versus the Seahawks to win the game. And it actually came from a staff member watching their tape and identifying that a particular pick would work because of the movement of the defensive backs. And then they coached it with the scout team, and the scout team said, like, listen, you're going to have, this is the way to combat it. And it turned out that was one of the plays that got used by the Seahawks, and the scout team had shown it to the starting 11 and allowed them to come up with a strategy to assist it. And so you think that, yeah, they're not the ones that have necessarily been on the podium and going out and getting a Super Bowl ring, but actually by the way that they prepared, by doing their research, by analysing the opponents and coming with energy to that practice, probably allowed them to go and win the Super Bowl. So I think it's a really nice anecdote around, even if you're not necessarily in the team now, the way you go about your business to support what is the current first team might get you a chance or might help us win games, and it gets noticed by people around the building. And I guess for you guys, that's a big one, right? Noticing when people are displaying those behaviours.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. I think that's a great video, by the way. I love that video. It's a really good one to show players that help the other team prepare, or the opposition, the non-23. But the key is highlighting it, reviewing it, putting up in lights when those guys do a really good job. And I think Graham and the assistant coaches at the club, I would say that's one of the real strengths, is making people feel really invested in making the team better, even when they're not starting at the weekend. And I think that again, there's a high value attached to that in our environment, and it certainly helps drive competitiveness.
No, it's really good. And then in terms of your overall pathway, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask that again. In terms of your overall pathway, how do you manage the volume of playing coming to the program? So I saw a statistic or a study on Twitter the other day that said, essentially with talent identification, you need to keep as many players in your vision or in your building for as long as possible, because the understanding of what peaks and troughs and potential performance look like is so challenging that to go at under nines, yeah, this is going to be our group, is really good, but also to write someone off who's going for a bad period is equally as difficult. So how do you go around managing and keeping eyes on players that maybe aren't in your pathway now that might be down the road, or giving opportunities for late maturers or late bloomers to come into the pathway?
Yeah, no, look, that's a great question. It's a very deliberate consideration of how we design and operate our pathway, and it has to be. That phrase you use there, as many as possible, as long as possible, comes from a bit of research. I think a guy called Erkstad, a Norwegian piece of research, and it was based on the club that Erling Haaland came from. So my understanding is 6 players in a really small town in Norway, based on their program of as many as possible, as long as possible, have a really disproportionate amount of success. And what they did is they brought a lot of players to a certain level. And, again, I know that's just one case study, but we just took a little tweak on that, and as many as possible, as long as possible, but then in brackets, as good as possible. So we just have to make sure that there's a credibility piece attached to it as well, that, to be in the Munster pathway, you need to be at a certain level. So I suppose, like any good magpie, rob it, tweak it, and make it your own a small little bit. But the concept is very valid in our context, in our environment. I think if we were to look at other provinces in our country, they're maybe getting players that are a little bit more ready by the time they come out of school. So we need to widen our base, because that suits our context, and I think a very good example somebody highlighted to me recently is, if you're recruiting for pilots to go to war, you have to have a really narrow pathway. Criteria have to be so high. But even if you're recruiting a team to go into a tank, there's 4 to 6 of them in it, so your base is much wider. And again, I think you need to make decisions that are relative to your context. And it came from a bit of army research. From our point of view, we have to keep it wide, because we have a lot of late developers, and maybe in an ideal world, some of our S&C systems will kick in a bit younger, and we wouldn't have players maybe developing as late physically, and we could make decisions earlier. But the reality is, right now, we have to keep that base wide. So I think it's important that you've really clear criteria how people progress. But if somebody is deselected, there has to be a credible route back into the pathway. And we've 2 guys that played a senior game last Saturday that, if we didn't have that system, they wouldn't have come back into the pathway. And both of them have big futures ahead of them, I've no doubt. So they're good case studies to have again. So yeah, as many as possible, as long as possible, but it's important it's as good as possible too.
And how do you manage the deselection piece? Because I imagine it'd be really easy, and some clubs have been guilty of this, where they deselect and go, right, you're trash now, we're done, we'll see you later. Whereas actually what you need is a useful framework or a useful process that allows them to still feel valued and say, maybe this isn't the right environment for you right now, but it could be in 6 months, 6 years time, and there's still potential of having a future with us.
Yeah, that's absolutely massive. And again, it's having clear policies around how you deselect and why you deselect. I think first of all, we take a strengths-based approach. We look at what players can do versus what they can't. And that's again very particular. And we use that terminology all the time, is what can they do? What capacity have they to improve? And that's one of the things that we talk about quite regularly. I suppose there's two types of errors. There's a false positive and a false negative. And the one that we want to avoid is the false negative. People that we release from our pathway or deselect that could have made it. And it's a bit of a sliding doors thing, because Michael, if we both, I suppose, are in contention to go into a pathway and you go through and I don't, my world changes, because I don't have the accumulated advantages that you have now. I don't have the environment that you have. I don't have the experiences, the coaching, the support. So we take our time, and we're comfortable being in the grey on that, and we hedge our bets a little bit. So we keep more bets on the table, and I don't want to kind of reduce it too much to that, but we take a kind of a probabilistic view rather than what's called a deterministic view, where we look at what people could become, and we make sure that we have a wide enough base to incorporate or to include, so really inclusive. But what we do is we run parallel programs. So I'll give you one example. An NTS for us is a national talent squad. They're connected to a national depth chart. We provide the same service to PTS, which is provincial talent squad, because we know that players emerge later in our environment. We have a very high degree of success from that PTS, whereas if we didn't have that and we deselected completely, we're missing out on a potential pipeline of players. So that's kind of one aspect of it, how we structure our pathway. And then where we're very lucky, we have a very strong club game. So we often deselect, and we have a process in place to observe them playing in the All-Ireland League. And we use a phrase like, okay, you're not going to come in the front door of the pathway now, but we've lots of evidence where people have come in the side door a year or two later, just to make sure that they know they're constantly being watched, observed, and where possible, try give them regular feedback from coaches within the system.
Yeah, I really like that feedback bit and being able to observe and stuff as well. And the strength side is interesting, because I'd imagine you could say to someone, listen, at the moment, this is your strength. It's not quite good enough for you to be within this pathway. However, you can do X, Y, and Z to make that a super strength and be a Shane Warne example. Alongside that, here's some other areas that we think would be of benefit, and it allows them to have a self-awareness piece of what they're good at. What's your USP going to be to allow you to be at the top level? But also you've got some, I guess, tertiary bits that you bolt onto the side of it to make a whole bit. So I think that's a really nice process that you described in terms of allowing people to progress and have an understanding of where they need to give some more time that might allow them to come in through the side door.
Yeah, and I think it's again, the strategic piece is around the decision making. How do you make the decisions and when do you make them? So when are the time points? What are the numbers, etc. Because talent, it's fluid and continuous. It can emerge at any point. So it's important that it's pretty open ended, and it's not always just about deselection. For us, it's about decisions to delay somebody moving from one part of the pathway to another, and we've had some good success. One in particular where we felt one of the best under 20 players in the country wasn't brought into the academy at the start of the season. We didn't bring him in because he wasn't demonstrating some of the characteristics that we needed. He responded incredibly positively and is one of our highest performing players. You could argue that was going to happen anyway if he'd come into the environment, but the decision was taken with the information that we had at that point. At that time, the decision was taken to delay entry. He understood really clearly why he wasn't being brought in and what we were looking for and what the expectations were, and he met them and went beyond them. So again, it's very individual and it's very context specific.
Awesome. I'm conscious of time, so one last question for you, even though we could talk like this for hours, which is if I were to ask the people that you work with to describe you in 3 words, how would you hope they described you and why?
Ooh, I'd like to think passionate would be right up there. I'm very privileged, absolutely love what I do. I've surprised myself by how passionate I am about talent development and player development and systems and structures, because I've been coaching for 20 years. So hopefully that comes across. I would say attention to detail. That would be something that probably associated with the way I coach. I'd be quite methodical. And then I hope that people would say that, I really care about people improving, developing, and care about them as individuals. And I don't mind saying I would say that was something that I wasn't explicit about, when I spent too much time behind a laptop as a younger coach. But hopefully people would recognize that's something that I've worked hard on, after reflecting.
Awesome. Listen, Ian, yeah, amazing conversation. It was one that we'll definitely pick up again further down the road, but really appreciate your time, and we'll catch up soon, no doubt, because we've been in constant contact. So yeah, look forward to our next chat.
Thanks a million, Michael. Really appreciate having me on.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Initiative podcast with me, Michael Wright. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at the Sports Initiative Podcast, and share this podcast with friends and family. I'll see you next week.